Every once in a while, there'll be a comic book that I'll come across that'll have some kind of error or weird misprint or some kind of weird drawing. And do you ever think to yourself, how did this get in here? Well, usually the editor and publisher will catch those errors before they ever release the comic, but in some cases, they will release the comic book and it'll be too late. And so the publisher will have to recall those comic books. And what they end up doing after they get the comic books back in is they destroy them all. But every once in a while, some slip through the cracks and make it into hands of customers. From racial slurs, straight up dicks being drawn, and even an error so bad that the artist got fired for doing it. So in this video, we're going to look at some of the weirdest recalled comic books. Elseworlds 80-page giant. Now, this got recalled, but there's still about 700 copies that still exist out there. Recently, a 10-0 sold of this for almost $5,000. The reason why this was recalled was in this comic book, there is a story about Clark Kent as a baby. And when the mom and pa Kent went out on a date, they would hire this babysitter to watch little Clark Kent. And hijinks ensued. But one of the panels showed little baby Clark Kent getting into a microwave and it being turned on. Of course, he's Superman, so he was fine. But after it was released, the publisher thought, this is probably not a very good idea and we'll probably get some flack. So he recalled the comic books. Of course, some comic books still made it out. The funny thing is though, the ones that did make it out got in the hands of many people who read it and liked the story. They liked the story so much that that story won an Eisner Award, which is basically, I think of like the Oscars for comic books. Well, the editor was like, I can't believe I recalled this. They reprinted that same story in another issue down the line. Swamp Thing 11. Less than 50 copies of this exist, and it rarely ever sells, and an 8.0 recently sold for $225. After it's released, the publisher saw what was inside of it and said, hey, we need to recall those. So they go to all the comic book shops and everyone, the distributors and everyone that got one, and they say, send them on back, and they destroyed them. But about 50 copies made it out, and what was so bad in this comic book that they need to recall it? Well, the writer, after completing his story and the artist drawing everything, the writer looked at the book and was like, you know what? We need more tentacles on this monster. So he drew a couple more tentacles, and it just so happened that the colorist colored them flesh colored, and the tentacles happened to remind people of a giant penis. So after the editor saw the final thing, he was like, no. And he recalled them all, and in later issues, they updated it by taking out those tentacles that kind of look like a penis. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles number 4. Now, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was such a huge hit, they figured they should create another series based off the Turtles. So they were going to create Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. At the same time, they went to the printers to reprint issue number 4 for its second printing. But at the printers, they kind of got confused and mixed up the covers. The cover that was supposed to be on Turtles number 4, the second print, was actually the cover for Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Well, they printed about 60,000 copies, and once they found that out, they recalled them all, but they were only able to recover all but 1,000 copies. So there's roughly about 1,000 copies out there of this error misprint. And a 9.8 is going to run you close to $3,000. Action Comics 869. There's about 1,000 copies of this that remain. So on the cover, it shows Superman hanging out with his dad at the farmhouse. But for some reason, they're sitting around just having a beer in their hands, and DC, after it was already released, was like, oh, no, we can't have that. I mean, look, his Superman S is showing, and he's hanging out with his dad and a beer in his hand. So they recalled all those covers and changed it to Soda Pop. He's an adult. He's Superman. He is not Superboy. He is Superman. So yes, he can drink alcohol, and I would imagine that Superman would be drinking alcohol. He wasn't getting drunk. He just had it in his hands. So it's just so dumb. It's like, come on. Who do you think's reading these comic books? And even if they were kids that are reading the comic books, say like 13 or something like that, I think they could grasp the concept of Superman being an adult and having a beer in his hand. Needless to say, there's about 1,000 copies of this that remain, and a 9.8 is worth around $300. SpiderGwen number 1, the Comics King variant. This variant was supposed to be for a Comic-Con, but when the Comics King saw their variant, they noticed that their logo wasn't right. It wasn't really bold enough, and so they complained. They got them all destroyed, except about 1,000. Also, the Marvel logo wasn't centered for some reason. I don't know. Well, anyways, about 1,000 copies remained because they were given out prior to the Comic-Con, and a 9.8 can run you about $150. The Matrix comic book preview comic. This one's just so dumb. So Before the movie comes out, they wanted to basically promote the movie, so they came out with a comic book version that kind of followed the movie slightly. Anyways, they released the comic book, but the publisher that released it realized, even though it was for an R-rated movie, they thought that the contents of the comic book was for mature audience, so recalled them all. It's like, you're making a comic book for an R-rated mature movie. Needless to say, they recalled all the comic books. They didn't reprint it again, but about 2,000 of those comics still exist. A 9A is going to run you about $200. Haley the Hooters Girl. Well, Cabbage Book Comics decided to make a comic book called Haley the Hooters Girl about a girl at Hooters. Well, they never asked Hooters for permission to use their likeness, and so they ended up getting sued by Hooters. Well, they made 7,000 comics of this, 2,000 of which were the gold edition, but by the time the lawsuit came, most of the comics had already been sold and given out, so they recalled the small amount that was still remaining. Elektra number 3. So after the comic book was already released and out, the publisher then decided to look through it and realized that he didn't like the fact that there was a scene where Elektra was nude. Now, you couldn't see anything, but it was suggestive and it was kind of from the backside. For some reason, had a problem with that. So they recalled the comic book, and what did they end up doing? They basically drew a little line that kind of looked like underwear on her, and then they reprinted that one. But there's already a ton that are out there, about 5,000 that are currently still out there, and a 9A can run you about $325. Universe X Spidey number 1. Now, I don't know how someone discovered this, but they somehow did. And it even caused the artist to get fired. So some retailers can sign up to Marvel or DC's campaigns that are like a first look, where they get the first chance to look through these books before it goes out to the masses. So they sent it out to the first look retailers. And it wasn't until the retailers noticed something drawn on the bookshelf if you turn the comic sideways. Artist Al Milgrom was the artist that worked on the book, and he drew something negative about Marvel editor Bob Harris, who is actually just about to be fired. So if you look at the bookshelf, you can kind of make out the words that say, Harris, haha, he's gone, good riddance to bad rubbish, he was a nasty SOB. Once Marvel found out, they recalled the comic books and fired Al Milgrom, but they rehired him several weeks later. This comic had variant covers, so cover A, there's only about 500 exist, but then the variant cover, there's only about 50 that exist. And a 9A is going to run you between $500 to $600. All-Star Batman and Robin number 10. Now, normally in this series, the characters would sometimes use foul language, and they would just black out the words. It was part of the artistic comic book. But in this issue, for some reason, the printer used 2 different blacks to black out the word and also print the word itself. And since there are 2 different blacks, they actually made one show through, so you could read all the foul language that was in there. Anyways, DC recalled it. There's about 500 copies that remain, and a 9A is going to run you about $125. Genlock number 6. So Genlock number 5 only had an entire print run of 4,000 copies, and when this one, number 6, was going to get made, the pandemic hit. DC felt it wasn't really worth it to distribute this comic book, and this wanted to make it a digital comic book only. But it's already too late for the UK ones because they're already sent out. But all the ones that were supposed to be distributed in the United States, they just destroyed those. So the only ones left are from the UK, and there's about 200 of them, and a 9A is going to run you about $110. Supergirl 33, the original cover had the title Year of the Villain, Dark Gifts, and by this time the storyline had already changed. So it was an outdated storyline. So they redid the cover and changed out that, but by then they had to recall all those comic books. 1,000 of those comic books still made it out there, and a 9A is going to run you about $80 to $100. Saga 41, after they sent out the comic book, they kind of realized that the cover was too dark, and so they fixed the stuff they needed to do in the printing process, recalled all the original ones they sent out, and then reprinted it with a brighter, lighter cover. There's about 1,000 copies that made it out, and a 9A is worth about $60. Wolverine 131. Now this one is a weird one. I really don't understand how this even happened. There's a lot of moving parts, and I think they kind of made an excuse on why this happened the way that it did. They hired Brian Vaughan to write the script for this comic. And in the script, he wrote Sabretooth the Assassin. Well, the editor didn't like the word assassin, so he wrote Sabretooth the Killer. But apparently when he wrote the edits, he just wrote it on there and he faxed over the edits and then went to, the letterer. From the editor's point of view, I think he's covering for himself. is he said that the word killer, when he wrote it on the side, when he faxed it over, kind of got cut off. Well, the letterer would then have to write down the letters that he wrote. And he wrote a racial slur, and somehow it made it into print because the editor said, well, he didn't look at it because he's like, well, I already edited it the first time. I don't need to look at it again. Well, it made it out there. And Marvel had their first look, so certain retailers got a first sneak peek of the comic book before other ones. And in it, they realized, this racial slur, I don't think it's supposed to be in here. And so then Marvel freaked out, and they didn't want the bad press because they just came off out of a bankruptcy. So they hurried up and tried to get it in, but it was a little too late because the news still found out about it, and he got in a whole bunch of trouble. But I think he was just trying to cover himself, saying, no, I faxed it over and it got kind of cut off. But the words don't really match up the same. And then you would think the letterer who's writing it would be like, this doesn't really, why would you have him say this? And so, yeah, I don't understand how that all happened. Needless to say, there's about 1,000 copies out there, and they're worth about $60 in a 9.8. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen number 5. Now this one's kind of funny. So DC was the publisher of this comic book, even though it was made by Alan Moore's company. Well, this book is supposed to take place in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in it, they have these kind of funny ads. Like, imagine when you're flipping through a comic book and they have weird ads in there. This is kind of like a play on that. Well, one of the ads was for a female douche. And it was made by the Marvel company. So in it was like, Marvel company presents this female douche, whatever it does, for your vagina, blah, blah, blah. Well, anyways, it was made, sent out, and then one of the DC publishers or editors was like, oh no, we can't do that because we're going to get sued by Marvel. So they recalled every issue, and then the new one says, instead of by Marvel Co., it says Amaze Co. Funny thing is, it turns out that this was a real product made by Marvel Co. Now, Marvel Company did not exist as the comic book company as we know it. In 1902 through 1923, Marvel Company actually made this female douche device. Whatever happened to the company, I don't know. But a few years later, then Timely came out, which was the publisher of Marvel Comics. That was called Timely. They later turned to Atlas in like the 50s, and then in the 60s, they changed their name to Marvel. So it's not even the same Marvel company, but it's just kind of funny that they made this device as an ad, as a gag, but it was an actual real device that existed by Marvel Company. Well, only about 200 copies remain, and a 9.8 is worth about $1,200 to $1,300. Which is number 4. So they made 1,000 copies of this, and the cover actually had an error. It was supposed to say book 4, but it said book 3. So they recalled all of them except 69. I don't know how they knew the exact number, but 69 got out. A 9.8 is going to be worth about $400. Hero Bear and the Kid Annual number 1. So this is kind of a simple one. Page 5 was accidentally produced twice, and instead of going from page 5 and then you turn over 6 and then 7, it just went page 5, 6, page 5, 6. And so they had to recall them all. There's only about 300 copies that remain, but it's worth about $50 because there's not a high demand for it. Dead Rabbit number 1 and number 2. Dead Rabbits is a gang that existed in the 1800s. Now there's a bar in New York called the Dead Rabbits, which is kind of an homage to that Irish gang from back in the day. Well, Image Comics was making a comic book based off the Dead Rabbits. And when the Dead Rabbits bar found out, they sent a cease and desist letter to Image Comics saying that they own the trademark to the Dead Rabbits. Needless to say, Image didn't care, and they just kept on producing the comic. And so then the Dead Rabbits were like, fine, we're going to sue you. So they sued them for $2 million in damages. Well, by this time, issue 2 was already out the door. And then Image was like, well, maybe we'll take this serious. So they recalled issue 1 and 2, even though it was already out, and then canceled the entire series. Each issue is worth about $50 in a 9.8 because most of them were already all out. Most of these recalls are due to publishers and editors not really paying attention, and also the most ridiculous ones where they come out with a good story, but they think they're going to have all this backlash. Turns out like they don't, and it wins an award like the Superman babysitter, and then they're like, oh, okay, actually we're going to reprint this story again because it's so popular. Let me know if you know of any other recalled issues, and have a good day.